Welcome to an introduction to New Testament textual criticism. My name is George Medina. The question we want to answer today is, can we trust the text of the New Testament? Former believer, now skeptic, textual critic Bart Ehrman has asserted that we do not have the original manuscripts of any of the books of the New Testament. We have copies made from copies of copies of copies of the autographs. He has also said, what we can say with confidence is that there are more differences among the manuscripts than there are words in the New Testament. The problem: we do not possess the originals written by Mark, Luke, Paul, or any of the other authors of the New Testament. Since they wrote on perishable materials, the originals probably disintegrated within a few decades of their writing. The handwritten copies we do possess have textual differences at various places. Why so many variants? Because we have about 5,700 New Testament Greek manuscripts, more mistakes were made in copying by more people. This is simple mathematical statistics. Copies were made by hand by fallible humans. We do make mistakes. Each error, whether it be the spelling of a word, transposition of two letters, etc., is counted as a variant. If one word is spelled differently in 10 manuscripts, it is counted as 10 variants. Enter textual criticism. Gordon Fee explains, the goal of textual criticism is to determine which reading at any point of variation is most likely the original text, and which readings are the errors. Textual criticism is the tool scholars use to try to recover the original text as written by Mark, Luke, Paul, etc. Possible errors: omissions, additions, duplications, changing the order of words, jumping from the same letter or group of letters to another, either adding a line again or skipping a line altogether. Some have suggested that New Testament textual transmission was similar to the telephone game we used to play when we were kids. Remember, it was an oral game. You were supposed to speak fast. Sometimes they even told you to mumble. And you were not allowed to repeat the phrase you just said to the person next to you. Is that how the New Testament was transmitted? The answer is no. Once the autographs or the originals were in place, well, it's written, not oral. You are able to double check yourself. You're able to go back to the original source. And, of course, you have multiple witnesses you can consult with. So it definitely was not similar to the telephone game. Now let's see. How can we solve certain variants? Here we have a few variants, more than 15, in 7 different manuscripts. Can you figure out the original sentence? Notice that there are sometimes letters missing. Sometimes the letters are completely wrong. But when you take into consideration all of these variants, you certainly can discover what the original text said. Yes, textual criticism rocks. So we see that this is not an unsolvable problem. Even Bart Ehrman admits, in fact, the vast majority of the differences in our manuscripts are insignificant, irrelevant, and easy to explain. Far and away, the most common mistakes involve differences in spelling. Many others involve accidental omissions of words and phrases by careless scribes. Even though most variants are easily solved, the original text is more difficult to determine in certain places. When that happens, we want to ask, is doctrine affected by those variants? Craig Blomberg asserts, we insist that no doctrine of Christianity rests solely on textually disputed passages. What this means is that the oneness of God or the deity of Jesus, for instance, are not in peril due to variants in the text of the New Testament. One manuscript versus many manuscripts. What if we had only one manuscript of the New Testament? Well, first of all, it probably would become an idol to be worshipped, and people would do pilgrimages to visit the manuscript. But there we would also have questions on accuracy and reliability. That is, how can we prove that it was not changed at some point in history? There would be no way for us to prove it. Since we possess so many manuscripts, more than 5,700, and counting, the amount of manuscripts gives us a lot of material to study and compare to try to get to the original version. Comparing manuscripts. The New Testament has 5,700 plus manuscripts. Tacitus, there are only 20 manuscripts of his writings. Plato, 7 manuscripts. Caesar, 10 manuscripts. Suetonius, 8 manuscripts. And none of those is the original, or also known as autograph. Now, which one would you think could be reconstructed more accurately since you have more witnesses to compare? Obviously, the New Testament. The manuscript textual families. Families are groups of manuscripts that share similar readings and or place of circulation. The Alexandrian comes from Egypt, usually has shorter readings. The Western, from North Africa, Italy, Gaul, usually has longer readings. Then we have the Caesarean from Palestine, longer readings. But note that some scholars do not consider the Caesarean family classification as useful. And then there's the Byzantine or Koine. Some readings go back to the church at Antioch, circa 300. The Textus Receptus underlying the King James Version was based on the Byzantine text type. But we also have other witnesses to what the original text of the New Testament said. There are ancient versions in other languages like Syriac, Latin, Coptic, Armenian, Ethiopic, Georgian, Gothic, about 9,000 of them. And there's also the patristic citations by so-called church fathers, 37,000 mentions. And of course, there's a little uncertainty as to whether they were quoting the scripture exactly or they were just paraphrasing the New Testament. Now, questions to ask when dealing with variant readings. How many witnesses support a certain reading? That is, how many copies of manuscripts read the same way? Which reading is supported by the most ancient manuscripts? And here we talk about the date the manuscripts were written. And how geographical diverse is the evidence for a certain reading? Does it come from only one place or different places throughout the world? More questions to ask. What is the quality of the supporting witnesses? Their reliability. And also, which group of witnesses support the variant readings? Alexandrian, Western, Byzantine, or Caesarean? Methodology. When we have two variant readings and we want to choose the best option, what do we do? Well, first of all, the harder reading is preferred. That is the one that's unharmonized and awkward, because usually scribes would tend to try and fix readings to make them more simple or more understandable. The shorter reading is to be preferred. And we have to try to deny attempts at harmonization. That is, if the variant that you are reading parallels another place of the New Testament too exactly, beware. Or if it parallels the Septuagint too exactly, beware. What are the results of textual criticism? Well, the New Testament is better attested than any other written work of antiquity. More than 90% of the textual variants are easily resolved because of the abundance of Greek manuscripts and other witnesses, like patristic quotations and versions in other languages. The rest of the variants do not affect any major Christian doctrine. And so we have a virtually certain and trustworthy text of the New Testament. Some scholars calculate it's about 98.33% pure. That is unmatched by any other written work of antiquity. Conclusion. Even if the whole field of textual criticism were to completely fail in trying to arrive at the original text of the New Testament, a very unlikely situation to say the least. And let's pretend we only had two manuscripts, the most different manuscripts possible. A scholar concluded, the reality is that the amount of variation between the two most extremely different New Testament manuscripts would not fundamentally alter the message of the scriptures. And we concur with that assessment. Thank you very much for your attention to this presentation. For Defenders of the Faith, I am George Medina.